for joining us. I know that you have lots of places to be tonight, but thank you for showing up for one another. And more importantly, tonight for yourself, your service member, and those lives that you touch on a daily basis. My name is Sheila Repp, and I am one of your hosts along with Amy Selix. These calls are for you. They're a grassroots effort that we started almost a year ago to connect Space Force Guardian spouses and their local communities with connections, resources, and just come together. So with that, we've already kind of gone over the housekeeping with our cameras. And again, we will be recording. So if you have any questions that you don't want addressed in speaker mode, feel free to drop those in the chat and we can get those answered for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Amy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to express our gratitude to each of you for being here tonight. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're happy to have you. To the spouses who are our regulars, it's always lovely to see you. Tonight's going to look a little different. For candid conversations to be valuable, we must be responsive to the needs of our service and community. And sometimes that means, making a pivot. So we truly appreciate your understanding and flexibility regarding tonight's change of topic and focus. The last 2 weeks have been rough for many of us. Chief Frazier's passing has impacted some of us directly, others indirectly. But the loss has been felt deep and wide within our community, leaving us with a variety of emotions and grief. Tonight is about supporting each other and keeping each other safe. We have a lot of resources to share with you all, but we want to be very present and very intentional with tonight's conversation. So we are going to drop those resources into the chat later in the session. We're going to also email them to you as well. So we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have at the end of our guest's presentation. So with that, we're going to get right to it. I'm honored to introduce our guest for tonight, Dr. Carla Stumpf-Patton, the Senior Director of Suicide Pre- and Postvention at the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. Carla, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. And let me just switch over to my slide, make sure that you can see this. How's that coming on your visual?
Looks great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amy and Sheila, for that warm welcome. And thank you to all of you for having me. I am deeply saddened to know the reason as to why, but equally honored that you are trusting me to be here to be part of this really critical, important conversation. I just want to acknowledge, Amy and Sheila, your efforts at recognizing that, you and others within your community were very proactive about this and reached out to us at TAPS immediately to find out ways that you could be supportive in the community. And I just want to acknowledge how important that is. And the positive impact that can have in your community of being that source of support for one another. So we do have a lot to cover. I just want to briefly introduce who I am and where I come from. If you're not familiar with us at TAPS, that stands for Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. I am the Senior Director where I oversee all of our suicide prevention and postvention programs at TAPS. So all of the services and programs for all of those who've been impacted by a suicide within our military community falls under me. And this is something, that we do with survivors every day, but it's equally as important when we can help our larger military community. So I'll spend just a moment, if you don't know who we are, just so that you kind of understand as a resource after you leave here today. We are TAPS is a national nonprofit. And we are dedicated to supporting all of those who are grieving the loss of anyone who has ever served. So we help with all branches, all duty status, all eras, all causes of death, and we support all relationships. By and large, most of us are survivors who also have had a loss. We also have military wives and veterans who work with us at TAPS. So I myself am a loss survivor, so I come to you from also a very personal place. So by trade, I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I specialize in the areas of suicide and trauma and bereavement, particularly in the military, but I came by that from a very personal personal sense of losing a husband myself. So I was a young military wife when I suffered the loss of a spouse about 30 years ago, and was expecting a child at the time. And I later remarried another military member who had lost his spouse, his dependent spouse. So as a blended military family, this had impacted us personally, but from a professional role, and my role at TAPS, we want to be here also to offer hope on the other side of that. So from personal experiences of how we have survived that, to help those who are new in this loss to know how you can get through this too, and that there can be a pathway, like a healing and hopeful pathway forward. So actually, before I start here, I also like to just start out from like from a personal nature. And as Amy and Sheila had said, I also want to just offer my heartfelt condolences on the loss within your community of Chief Frazier. I did not know him personally, and I'm not necessarily within your immediate community, but I'm part of your military community and part of your TAPS community. And so I like to kind of start off by just saying that tonight, while this is in response to a very personal loss for all of you, I don't want you to think that I'm underestimating the value of that, but the content of what I'm going to be covering is not going to be personal in nature. So I'm not here to give answers or to elaborate or speculate on anything personal. It's really kind of understanding grief and loss and supporting one another within your community. I just want you to know that I acknowledge both of those. So in no way am I bypassing the personal nature of how you all have been impacted. And with that being said, I don't know how the extent of how each of you has been impacted by suicide. You could have been impacted in other ways as well. And sometimes in the audience, we might have spouses on the line, and depending on your relationship to somebody who has died by suicide, in addition to how you have already perhaps been touched in your own life, it can impact our grief in different ways. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. So without further ado, what I like to start off with is just having an understanding about suicide, because so many times people don't understand some of the top, kind of like the topics and the themes, and we know a lot about kind of prevention and education and awareness of things, before a suicide occurs, and interventions that oftentimes are in the middle of a crisis or perhaps during a crisis, and different people might be responding in different ways depending on their roles. And what we're going to be focusing on tonight is a term called postvention. In the field of suicidology, that's not new, but for some of you, that might be a new term. And that refers to the support and the services and the care that's given to all of those after either a suicide attempt or in many cases a suicide death has occurred. It's a large part of what we do at TAPS. We also do a lot of prevention and intervention as well, but a core of what we do has been a leader in the field of suicide postvention. And the reason why this is really critical to understand is that postvention support, what you all have already been instinctually doing for one another, is critical for future prevention efforts. And so it goes far beyond grief and loss support. It does include that, but the whole goal of postvention really is creating a sense of safety in the community and connection, and building in protective factors and getting connected to resources, and ultimately reducing risk amongst a population where we could be at increased risk, because we know when somebody has been impacted by suicide, they could be at increased risk potentially themselves, particularly when they're not offered really good quality postvention care. So when we think in the bigger picture right now, it is really about supporting one another in the grief and loss and processing that and giving it the time and space. But there is an end goal that it can be highly preventative, right? It could be preventative around mental health concerns and substance use and addiction issues, and as I said, even suicide risk. So when we talk about suicide and topics, such as this, it's always important that we do that, and such as what I'm doing here too, and what we've done tonight is from a trauma-informed perspective. And our goal there is we always want to have a safe environment. We did that tonight when we, said, we're all here for one another, and you will hear this throughout tonight's talk, that we're going to be giving you resources. TAPS will be one of them. This is a safe place where you can share openly, that if you or somebody you know is struggling even beyond grief and loss, and maybe with thoughts of suicide, that this is a safe place where you're not alone. You can be connected to help and care. And our goal is to just foster that connection that helps to build upon those relationships and strengthening communities such as yours, what you've already been doing beautifully. And we do that by supporting each other. A large part of what we're doing here, learning maybe new information, maybe coping skills and tools, perhaps, if you haven't been impacted by a suicide loss before, things that could be helpful now as you're navigating the loss. So we always want to do that from a trauma-informed perspective, so people know from the beginning, we're talking about a heavy topic tonight, and it could bring up different emotions for you depending on your own experiences. That's normal, but we also want you to know you're not alone in that, and that if and when you should need support, even if it's throughout our presentation, if you need to message, one of us as the facilitators to talk one-on-one or afterwards, we will be here to support with that as well. Okay. So just a little bit about at TAPS, just so you know, our kind of our place in the field of postvention, suicide loss is one of the leading causes that people come to us for support, right next to illness and toxic exposure losses. We have been developing this program for about 16, 17 years, specifically responding to a military suicide loss survivors. And very tragically, very sadly, we have well over 25,000 suicide loss survivors within our database, whom we have been supporting since around 2007 or so, when we really kind of built out this very specialized programming. And as suicide loss survivors ourselves and working with fellow loss survivors, we know that we have unique needs, and suicide loss can feel very different. With that can come unique needs and issues that might be different from other causes of death, that we really need a safe place to process that, to talk about it, and to learn about it. And that's exactly what we are doing here tonight. Okay. And so we're going to share some of what we have learned, some of what we do with you, and hopes that that could be helpful for you and your community. And so when we look at postvention and think about what, like, kind of prioritizing, we want to make sure that we're caring for everybody who may have been impacted by that we're not overlooking somebody even on the peripheral that might be needing support. Sometimes helping to understand suicide can also help when we are just trying to understand the loss, kind of understanding the complex nature of suicide, some of the contributing factors, maybe theories behind how suicide occurs, and understanding the suicidal mind, because it just helps us understand something that for many people, we don't understand it. And we want to know, why did this happen? What caused it to happen? And it's important to know that suicide is just far too complex to be answered in such a simplistic way. It really is complex and involves many complicating contributing factors. And so because of that, it needs, a depth of understanding as well. But by doing what you're doing, you're also kind of understanding ways that can help you in your grieving, and maybe even modeling that to others, maybe for people who couldn't be here tonight or who may be not comfortable talking about this. And so when we start having this dialogue and talking about it openly, we are really modeling a healthy way to cope with suicide loss that historically has been shrouded by judgment and stigma and taboo, and really kind of kept in the closet and very kind of silenced. And we know that when it comes to suicide, silence really can prove to be fatal. So one of the things that can be helpful around just awareness around that is just starting to talk about that. And so while we're kind of focused on grief and loss, it really is, when we think about that safety piece, we still want to think about other people who might be struggling or maybe just kind of dealing with some kind of higher risk factors and if they might be needing support. We know also at TAPS, we are, as I mentioned, many of us are either loss survivors or in the military community. We're a peer-based grief support organization. So we're founded by a survivor, kind of run by many survivors, for survivors. We know that peer-based support is really just one of the key factors in helping this. So your own community of peers really are one of your strongest assets, because that also is helping people connect, not feeling isolated and alone. So those are protective factors. And we also want to try to promote people into what we would call help-seeking behaviors, encouraging them, anytime, whether they're needing help for grief and loss or maybe other issues, that the help is out there. It really does work. You're not alone. If you don't know how to find it, we can help you find it. We want to encourage and really commend people for reaching out and seeking that help so that they're not kind of struggling in silence and going through things alone. So again, as I mentioned earlier, our goal is always to decrease risk, whatever that may be around, and promote and increase this sense of kind of healing and hope that, there's a hopeful future ahead, that with support and help, people can get through these difficult times alone. So as I mentioned earlier, all of these things are highly preventative in nature. So with all of that, in the work that we did, we developed our own model around postvention. Now, I'm not going to go into this tonight. It's really a whole separate presentation in itself, but I thought it might be helpful just to have a visual, because so many times bereaved individuals, loss survivors will say, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Nobody gave us a manual. And, as survivors ourselves, we said, you know what, it would have been helpful if somebody gave me a manual and I know what I needed and I didn't have, or I know what helped, or I know, what didn't help. And we wanted people to kind of have a little bit of a framework and a guide to know that, we can't give you the exact answers. We don't know exactly how your journey is going to look, but there can be a path forward. And what we found is if we could work on stabilizing those most immediate issues, and this might be very much what some of you are seeing right now, we really focus on stabilization in the earliest, ideally hours, days, weeks, months. And these are some of the most critical issues that need immediate attention, immediate care. And it's going to look different. It might look different for the family than it might be for a unit or for a community or for, housing and, the office and in different areas. But the more we can address these immediate issues, we found that it was much more likely that people could then naturally process the very natural kind of response to grief and loss. But it's very hard to be able to grieve if there are a lot of these debilitating issues that need to be stabilized. Sometimes these involve kind of just, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But what we also found is when we could kind of work through these with some of these different tasks and meeting these needs, that in time that people started to actually experience post-traumatic growth, that the story somewhat changed. And instead of it being about the final moments of the death or the suicide, people could focus on the life that was lived. Or maybe a hopeful future and going forward for oneself. So finding meaning and purpose from the experiences that they have been through, and perhaps how does that change us, that we might use those experiences to help ourselves. Maybe it might change. In my case, it's changed my whole life's direction. But we find that many people at this point are wanting to maybe give back and maybe be a peer and maybe kind of going into the field and helping within the military community because they've been able to stabilize some key issues, get the help that they needed, process those emotions, whether it was through peer support, maybe professional care and counseling. And in time, when they were able to do that, they might go back into the role of a helper or a supporter. And if nothing else, it can be very helpful and healing for, a family, a unit, a military community. So this is just a very kind of brief framework around why we do what we do. So what I'm really going to focus on is that stabilization piece for the purpose of tonight. So when I talked about those those immediate issues that we look at, some of the most common ones that we respond to at TAPS and within the suicide community, and there are many more than this, and there might be here some that are not listed here. These are just but a few. And so, I just have a few that, we have webinars around, we have resources, we have handouts, we have a lot of resources because these are some of the most commonly sought after needs. So how do I talk about suicide with children and within our family, and really kind of complex, and very complicating, confusing feelings all happening, at once. And these questions about, like, if only, I or they or we would have, could have, should have, and why did this happen? And why didn't they ask for help? And why didn't we know better? And why didn't this person? Because when it comes to suicide, we want to have an answer. We want to be able to point our finger and get an answer for that. But, that kind of goes back to what I said earlier. It's far too complex to explain in a simplistic way. But again, these are very natural things for people to experience after going through a rather abnormal and extreme situation. And because of this, it can really kind of interfere with relationships and family systems, and kind of people going about grief in very different ways. And within that kind of thought around relationships, we all deal with it in very unique ways. So, what spouses experience could be very different than parents, and then that's different from children. And even within, say, the spouse community, that could vary from one spouse to another, and depending on the family dynamics. And, what we're kind of in this forum tonight, we're looking really kind of from your military community's perspective. So you all have very different relationships here, whether it was friends, coworkers, battle buddies, depending on who we have in the audience. And what I like to acknowledge about that is that just because you might not be what, in our military community, a primary next of kin, or maybe an immediate family member, it doesn't mean that you might not be grieving, and you might not have things that you are needing support with or coping with in your own way. And we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that just, based on a relationship, we still might be impacted by that loss. And one of the other things that we find a lot with suicide death, because it can be very traumatic in nature, just due to it being, unexpected, and many times it can be very graphic. There's oftentimes trauma attached to that might not be the case with other causes of death. So this impacts a large amount of the people that we support at TAPS. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit in just a little bit as well, but this kind of speaks to understanding the difference between grief and trauma, and why we also want to make sure that people are supported with that if and when they might be needing extra resources around that. Actually, here's the next slide on that. And so I just like to put these side by side, because when we think about grief, I just kind of want to acknowledge that grief is a very natural reaction to loss. It's not something that's pathological. It doesn't necessarily need treatment for it. It can, if it becomes kind of exacerbated and really kind of complex, but it is different from trauma, which is really rooted in the sense of fear and safety, particularly compromised safety of oneself or somebody else, or loss of life. So they come from two different places, but they kind of present and can feel and look very different. But some of the things can be very similar. It can interrupt our thoughts and maybe sleep disruptions, and we might have nightmares, and some of the symptoms can be somewhat similar. But with trauma, many of these symptoms become much more all-consuming. They can kind of impair different areas of our life, such as relationships and work. And many times, even within our military community, if we maybe have a spouse, or we know someone who's has coped with post-traumatic stress, some of these symptoms might seem or sound familiar. They really do come from very different places. But what happens many times is people don't understand trauma, and it's either kind of minimized or not acknowledged, and therefore it gets overlooked. And what's really important about that is if we fail or we miss the trauma piece, this is when people can really get kind of stuck or immobilized around some of the natural things around grief that they need support with, because the trauma can be so kind of debilitating. So that's something, if and when somebody is struggling with that, it's important to know again that there are really good resources. This is something that's treatable with help, that people, can experience relief from that. And it's just something to understand maybe in conversations, and going forward. So these are just a few more extra considerations on top of some of those other unique concerns. Again, I'm not going to really elaborate on all of them, but these are the things that can really complicate just suicide loss. And depending on your role or how involved you may be, some of these might not sound familiar, some of them might be, but some of the kind of complicating or compounding factors that people are having to deal with are, investigations and law enforcement and, first responders. And some of these situations can be traumatic in themselves, depending on how things are handled. Sometimes with suicide, not always, but in some cases, there might have been things prior to a suicide death that might have even been contributing factors. Sometimes we might know them, sometimes we might not, sometimes they might come out in investigations, sometimes they might be, part of rumors and gossip. And these are the things to be really, I think, sensitive, compassionate around, that even if this is the case, this isn't a time for say, judgment and shame. These are the things that remind us why we have to be so compassionate and understanding that, again, suicide is very complex and can have many contributing factors that maybe we know, maybe we don't know, maybe depending on who we are in our relationship. Some people might be aware of some people might not be aware of others. These are just some things to be aware of. We know that we can have a change in identity, a loss of our military community, or even within your community, losing a key figure is going to change your community. That type of a loss can't happen without change happening, but you're all being part of kind of a proactive change by supporting each other. But these are, again, some of the things that bring up questions. How are we going to handle memorials? How do we talk about it? If the press wants to be involved, how do we handle media coverage? How is this going to be talked about? That leads into language and safe messaging. This is something that we do a lot at TAPS. We have a lot of kind of PSAs. We have a very robust communications department. So, Suicide Prevention Month and responding to suicide losses in the community. We're usually very involved with that. I'll kind of elaborate on that in just a minute, but also significant dates and holidays, can be difficult. If there's a particular date within your community that, is something that typically you would celebrate, and of course, birthdays and special anniversaries and certain holidays can bring up a lot of emotions, and that might be a time for maybe added support and checking in on one another. I'll briefly talk about this. Again, this could be a whole presentation in itself, but I spoke about this earlier on the beginning, how, depending on relationships, the needs can be really different. What bereaved children need are going to be different from somebody kind of in an intimate partner relationship, again, different from siblings. And I don't know what other losses you may have had, but for the purpose of tonight, what I really wanted to focus on were those last two on the bottom. And just acknowledging that in addition to some of the most common relationships that loved ones and friends and neighbors and, members within the community, particularly our military community, this can be within, units and leadership and commands. This is a group of survivors that many times are just not acknowledged for their loss. And in the grief world, we would call that a disenfranchised griever. But many times people think, well, I don't deserve the support. You should be helping out their immediate family. Why am I struggling with this so much? It wasn't my loved one, but we're all military families here, and we know that we are a family and our bonds sometimes are closer than some people have in their blood relationships. And we really are still kind of like a family system in its own unique way. But, that can also change and feel different depending on who you are. There might be people who maybe we're not so close in a relationship, but are still feeling the impact within the community. And that loss is something that can still be felt kind of very deep and wide. An example of that might be when, if there's a death of somebody in a high profile, with a high profile kind of persona or celebrity, or in the public eye. When a death happens, it kind of impacts us still. We want to know, oh my gosh, what happened? How is their family? How are they doing? We want to understand, when you think about some of these other high profile people, Robin Williams is a good example of that, who impacted many people, but maybe people didn't know him personally, but they were really impacted by that loss. And I think that's just important for us to acknowledge that that's also really normal. And that's something that at TAPS, we will support anybody who is in need of that support. We're very inclusive in that regard. And in fact, I'm not going to go too much into this, but I thought it could be helpful in case we have anybody who is maybe either in a leadership role, or if your spouse is in a leadership role. This is, again, it's a whole separate kind of presentation, but it is something that we have resources on. I have some printouts that you can learn more, but we also find it, equally as important to give this type of post-vention support to those in a leadership role, because they have suffered a very personal loss, but at the same time, they're in a role that they're still having to take care of everybody else, where they still might feel the need that they're struggling with this loss and wanting to understand it in a very personal way. And so, it's just as critical. As I said earlier, once we've been impacted by a suicide, it can put people at increased risk. So within our military community, when we're personally impacted by that, it's going to impact everybody kind of within that scope. And so some of the same things I've already talked about here, we want to offer those trainings. We want to talk about understanding postvention and doing that in a safe way, and talking about, how we can do that with safe language and promoting help to people. And, that might look different in a family. It could look different in, a community setting, and it could look very different in a military unit, but the concepts kind of still apply. So if that's something that you think could be helpful, we have some good videos and some handouts, some really kind of quick reference materials, if that's something that anybody's needing after tonight. So one of the things, I'm going to check my time real quick. I know this is a lot of information coming at you really fast. So let me just grab a drink of water. How's everybody doing so far? I'm just going to do a check-in. I'm looking for Amy, Sheila. Am I getting some thumbs up?
You're good. You're good,
Okay.
Carla.
So one other thing that can be really helpful to understand when we are talking about suicide, particularly if there's been a loss, and it's even more so now with the access of social media, not just kind of media, but social media. And so when we talk about suicide, we always want to do it from a safe perspective. And so language really does matter, language and messaging. And this isn't something that, we're just trying to be like the language police here. We actually know, like with the evidence that has shown us, that when we can talk about suicide in a very productive, meaningful, and intentional way, it actually reduces suicides. People are more likely to call crisis lines. They're more likely to reach out to the resources that's shared to them. And likewise, when it's done in an unsafe way, it actually can spike suicide deaths. And we've learned this from past experiences. And, there are those of us who are on task force, dedicated to safe messaging. So this, again, whole presentation within itself. But it's important just to know this. And if this is something new, that's okay. You might have used some of the other language in the past. No problem. Maybe, this is something new to consider, but, I'll give one example, and that's the terminology around committed suicide. This is something, for suicidologists, decades we've tried to change this, and we finally are changing it, but we're also trying to change a culture and terminology that has been around for centuries. But some reasoning behind that, when we can change the language, when we talk about people who died by suicide, because they can die from car accidents, they can die from cancer, they can die from many different causes. People can die by suicide as well. So if we kind of normalize it from a public health perspective, it's taking out the judgment and the shame and the stigma that historically was always kind of related to like religious connotations and sin. And because of that, people likely, in the past wouldn't reach out for help because they would be shamed and judged because of it. So just by shifting our language, we know it can make a big difference. And I say this now, not from a prevention perspective, but more so if and when you see things a lot of times on social media, there could be things that are unsafe. Sometimes they're putting very graphic images, and people don't know. Sometimes, they don't know what they don't know. So they might be talking about it in an unsafe way. They might be sharing very graphic details. And these are the things that could unintentionally could be harmful to vulnerable people who are reading. So, when something is, whether it is in a blog or an article or a social media post, or even a reporter saying, on TV, it is being done in a safe way by a few things. They're going to usually lead with a header that says, the following, piece is going to talk about suicide. If you or someone is thinking of suicide, here's a number. They're normally going to give you resources, and there usually should be kind of underpinning it with messages of hope, that this is tragic and this was a horrible circumstance that happened, but we want you to know as a reader or the audience that there is help out there. You're not alone, and with that support you can get through this. And so the same thing could be said about those who are dealing with the loss. We want people to know that this can be really difficult to navigate alone, but there are resources, and with that support, you don't have to travel this path by yourself, and you're not alone in the things that you're going through. There are people who understand and who can be here to support you. And this is just an example. We have some handouts on this, like 1-2 pagers that if people want to print out, share, send in attachments. We have a lot of that on our website. I'm not going to play this now for sake of time, but we have a lot of PSAs available on our website, but we have a YouTube page. So if you're wanting PSAs around support, safe messaging, things of that nature, we have some of those resources as well. Let me get another drink of water. I feel my voice cracking. All right. We're getting close on time. So what I'm not going to elaborate on this too much here, but when we think about the risk, just like people who might be struggling with suicide thoughts, people who are loss survivors, like I said, could be at risk. These are just some of the things that people could be struggling with. Grief can be it can hurt a lot. And sometimes people, they don't want to feel the pain, and they might turn to other means to deal with that pain. They might be dealing with other mental health issues. So I say this, whether this can be helpful for yourself, for someone else you are supporting, for someone in your community, for a child, for anybody in your circle who might be struggling. It could be suicide loss, it could be other risk issues or other concerns, but these are some of the things to watch for, to look for, maybe just to be paying attention to. And the more that you kind of see and notice, the more, concern might be needed. And this is when we want to have conversations about suicide, kind of clear and direct conversations, particularly about staying safe. And so, as I kind of round out here, I'll just kind of this is just a quick recap, but important to know you're not alone, but this is just way too much to go alone, but you're already doing that just by what you're doing in your community. So again, commending all of you for really kind of creating that support. Really amplifying those peer-based supports, getting people connected to counseling if they need it. You're already kind of doing that education by deepening your understanding what we're doing here. If this is something that you do want to learn more about, there are some really great trainings out there from a prevention perspective or intervention perspective. We have a lot on postvention at TAPS, but if that's just something in general that you're curious or really wanting to learn more about, you can get in touch with me after this and I can kind of send you in the direction if you just want to learn more about the topic. But one thing that I want to spend just a minute on is this idea of safety planning. So I'm going to kind of go to this next slide before we kind of move into our kind of question and discussion. A safety plan, what I want to do is just normalize what this is. You do not have to be a doctor or a therapist or a clinician to make a safety plan. You can make one for yourself. You can do one. I mean, you could do one, and it doesn't have to be for suicide. It can be, we talk about safety for everything. We talk about bike safety, car safety. We do this all the time. So why not think about it from a preventative perspective for our mental well-being? Historically, safety plans are usually kind of more in place for people who might be having thoughts of suicide, but they can be used just for like times of really strong emotions. You could do this with kids, you could call it whatever you want to call it, but the whole point is it's part of that conversation. So if you find yourself talking to somebody who's needing more support or you're concerned about, it is helpful to know that, we could talk about staying safe. And it really is just how do I have that conversation and feel like we have a plan in place? And the whole point here is really to kind of be proactive rather than waiting for a crisis to happen. If we feel like we have a plan in place, the whole goal is to try to decrease things before kind of something escalates into a crisis. So talking about this ahead of time can be really helpful. And as I said, you could practice and do it on yourself. These are the things that we know, like if emotions are starting to get strong, how do I kind of know that within myself? And then what are some of my coping skills that help to balance that or de-escalate that crisis? And then who do I feel comfortable talking with? And if they're not available, who else could I put into my circle of support? So we're we're trying to build out that circle of support so people are feeling less alone and less isolated and more connected, right? And when you do this, you could take a picture of it on your phone. You could fold it. You could do it on an index card and keep it in your wallet. It's not something that has to be highly complicated, but in this day of technology, everybody loves apps. So I put a couple on here, some free apps. The first one, Got Your Back, is a free app created by a family who lost a teenage son, but they wanted to make it free. So anybody could have this app. They could put it on their phone, and it's just ways to stay safe and share it for people that are in your kind of your safety network, so to speak, who you feel comfortable talking with when you need to talk to somebody. But I'm going to give you an example here, and this is another one of our TAPS resources. If you want to print these out, you can, the link, you can keep it on your phone, and how simple it can be. But I think this just is important for us to think about, when a suicide happens, it's natural for us to be worried about other people too. And while we want to take the time to focus on grief and loss and focusing on how that's impacting us, we do want to think about prevention in the future and keeping ourselves safe and those around us safe. So I just like to touch on this so you are aware of what a safety plan is and what it looks like. And if and when you ever want it, there are free templates that you can just fill out, or you can kind of just do it on an app on your phone, okay? I'm going to kind of round it out here with a couple of our TAPS resources, but we're going to, I think, email these to you, so you don't have to like write everything down right now. But the one QR code is, we have a landing page where a lot of these resources are housed. And then the QR code with the 2 booklets are the books that we wrote, just kind of helping after a suicide loss. This can be really helpful. A lot of things that we talked about tonight are going to be in that guidebook. We wrote this as survivors, for survivors. It's really practical. It's doable. You could probably read it in a couple hours. It's free the e-download on the website, or here we have it in Spanish. And even if you're maybe not struggling with the loss so much yourself, it can be really helpful to read it to understand how you might support other people. Or if you're just wanting to really understand the impact of suicide, it can really be helpful with that. So one of the other resources at TAPS, we have our helpline. It's a 24/7 helpline. So any issues around grief and loss, you can contact us at any time. Our staff, us who will answer. We can get people connected to care. If you want to refer people to us, that's another quick way, but it's a resource that's always available for you. And then I've got my email here. And so let's see. All right, we have almost 13 minutes. So I know that is a lot of information coming at you, a lot to process, but I wanted to give you all time just to open it up for questions, discussions. If there's something you wanted me to go back to or elaborate on, or anything I can support with. And I'll check. I don't see anything in the chat yet, but I know you all were kind of holding that. Let's see. Any thoughts coming up for anybody? Or questions? I see Laura has a hand raised. Is that right?
Hi.
Hi. You're so polite with raising your hand.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I think I have kind of general questions around how we as a community can start working to move that kind of needle within military culture around stigma. I know we've made some really big gains in the last 10 years or so, but I know there's still work to be done. So I'm interested in like participating in that and just getting some thoughts from the side, from this internal side of things of what we can do, whether or not it's laws or policy or just kind of internal gradual impact as spouses. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I love that question. And without it being too complicated, I just want to acknowledge you're already doing it because it's having these conversations. Again, historically, this is something that was just silenced and kind of swept under the rug. My loss came from a time when there was no veterans crisis line. There was no suicide prevention coordinator. The military did not utter the word. And so like there was a time when this was, not only was it not discussed, but it was hidden, it was kept quiet, it was pushed down, it was silenced. And we know that can be deadly. And so this is, we are trying to change a culture. And not only that, we're trying to change military culture. And so it's happening. It's taking a while. And unfortunately, we're losing people and, one loss is too many. And particularly like when it's our person, it's the only one, the statistics, that might help us to measure if things are helping. But when it's our person, the only one that matters is the one that, we have lost. But when we talk about it, it's changing the conversation because we're inviting the dialogue and we're saying, we're kind of giving the invitation to talk about it. So like even having this conversation tonight, that's a really bold, courageous move because it's saying, we're going to talk about this. We want to acknowledge this. We want to acknowledge together how we're impacted and start the conversation. And what I would also say is maybe let this just be the springboard for that, but to continue these conversations with your group, with one another, your spouses, your community, and just start talking about it. And, it's something that's suicide in itself is hard to talk about until it happens to you. And then it just feels like, why isn't this something we're not talking about more? And sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about it. Sometimes people are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to hurt you or make it worse. But when that happens, then people kind of feel like, well, you're not talking about it and now I'm all alone. And so just opening up the conversation, inviting people to the dialogue. And some people might not be comfortable with that, but I say that because it can start with each of us. And so you can start small within your circle. And, there are, TAPS. We do a lot around advocacy and policy and legislation. That's on a big kind of macro level. But, we all can take part in that, really depending on what you're comfortable with. And sometimes in the beginning, it's helpful just to learn information. Learning more about this topic so people feel more comfortable talking about it. But just being the one who is saying, I'm willing to listen. I want to be a part of the conversation. You're doing a lot more than you could even imagine. So good for you. Great. Thanks for that really, that poignant question. I really appreciate that. I see some good comments. Yes, thanks, Christy. Some of the materials for 988. So if you're wanting, magnets and bumper stickers and posters through SAMHSA, all of those things are free. You have to order them, and sometimes whether they have them, they'll ship them out. But that's another great resource to share, kind of like wallet guides and the 988 number, so people know. I don't have it on here, but another around some of those resources, whether it's the Veterans Crisis Line, 988, the crisis text line. You can also Google all of those things and get the image on your phone. So if I'm talking to somebody, even in that SAFE plan, you could put that on a SAFE plan, and I might send them, I'll send them the image, and I'll say, here's the 988 number, save it to your images too. Or, maybe take that and program 988 into your contacts. So just in case, if I'm not available, you have another backup that you can call. So those extra resources are really good just to be aware of. So, it's not one size fits all. What works for one person, somebody might not want to talk on the phone. They might be more comfortable texting, for example. In particular around the grief and loss issues, TAP stands ready to support all of you in your community if you need any extra support with that. Hey, any other thoughts or questions? I don't see, let me see if I can.
I'm not seeing any
Okay.
either,
Just wanted to
Carla.
make sure I wasn't missing anything.
No, Carla, thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful for everything that you do and the invaluable resources that TAPS provides. I know Sheila and I are also grateful for everyone joining us tonight in the audience. Tonight's conversation was a hard one, but we really felt that it was essential. And moving forward, the best way to honor Chief Frazier is to look after each other. So I'll just say, if anyone has any last questions or comments, now's the time.
And I'm happy, Amy, I can stay on for a couple minutes. So if people leave, if there is anybody who wants to stay for a moment, I'm happy to stay for a couple minutes, or people can also email one-on-one. So.
Okay. Sheila, do you mind dropping that resource?
I just did. Just as a reminder, we will email it to you when the newsletter comes out, but we wanted everyone to have the links that Carla shared with us tonight and some other resources that have been shared with us and our units over the last couple of weeks. So that guide is there as well for you if you have any questions, or if there's something that you have found that has been a useful resource to you or it's been shared with you. We would love to add further to that. So please email them to us so that we all have the tools in our toolkit.
Laura, did you have another question?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a large question to ask, but you may have a more straightforward answer than I anticipate. I know in this military culture, when some of these situations happen, you see like an individual who's struggling with a situation and they feel like they don't have a way out. And then they also have the fear of like losing job, losing clearance, stigma within the culture. How do you, within your community, kind of address that conversation? Like, I know as a civilian, to me, it's like your life is more important than your job. Your family is more important than your job. But in the military, your identity is so tied to this component.
Yeah.
And it can almost, if you lose your job, you lose your community, it can feel like you're losing your life as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like rock hard place and fear from both sides. And I know there's like the tied in component with a lot of misinformation around PTSD and the inability to recover from it, like not having content around that.
Right.
I was just kind of curious how you approach those conversations within your program, navigating that rock and hard place situation,
I'm gonna,
if you have answers or
yeah.
solutions to that.
And I
Yeah.
want to do it justice without elaborating, because again, this could be an entire presentation. But we do a lot of work with leadership, of course, around that a lot. We've got a lot of feedback from people. I mean, my own husband included. This is usually one of the contributing factors where there was a fear of asking for help out of fear of reprisal, fear of how it would, affect security clearance and one's career. And historically, this has been, this is very common with military and law enforcement, and they're going to lose their weapon, they're going to have their wings taken away, and so it's very difficult, right? Because these are things that are their livelihood, this is their identity, but at the same time, the one thing that could make them vital in their military role, even in a fighting force, is the one thing that could be deadly in a personal level. And so how do we navigate that, right? And that it really has to come from leadership, because that messaging has to come from top down about they how do they have that conversation? How do they support people seeking help? Because there have been people who reached out for help who were hazed or condemned or shamed even, and not in some cases, not all cases, but or they were weak, or they were a coward for needing to go to the psych doctor or whatever that might be. But we really need to shift that narrative that asking for help is courageous, and it's something, like, I will say from a personal perspective, some of the most impactful statements that I have ever seen were the ones from the highest ranking people who shared their experiences with junior service members. So when I've maybe done a postvention response with a large unit, and one of the senior leaders came forward, and I asked them, I said, if you're telling me you're asking me what would help, what would really be helpful if you have senior people talked about getting help and how it didn't ruin their career. Because people need to know that, 4-star has, they're human too, and they've had struggles, and guess what? They might not ever tell anybody, but they might have gotten help too. And you know what? It made them a stronger leader. Not only did it not ruin their career, but it made them a stronger leader because they're healthier. And if we looked at any other part that made somebody ready for fitness, when we think about the military mindset and being operational ready, there's so many things. They had to be physically fit. They are, top of their field, the training that goes into it. Why would we overlook the need for their brain health? Because if they had a physical injury to their body, they'd see the doc, they'd be going to PT, they'd be on rehab, they'd take the time off. And our goal would be to stabilize them, get them healthy and back for duty. And wouldn't the same be, for dealing with a mental health issue, ideally? But of course, people are thinking, well, then if I'm out, somebody has to do my job, and I don't want, the whole unit's going to suffer because now I'm getting help, or they're going to see me going down the hall talking to the chaplain, and all of these things that are getting in the way. But the bottom line is, once they're gone, everyone's going to suffer, and we can't bring them back. And they're worried about losing their security clearance, they're worried about their military role. But in the bigger picture, if they lose their life, none of that would matter anyway. And so it is a really difficult challenge, because we're trying to change the mindset that's oftentimes drilled into people. But if the language changes in the culture coming from leadership, it really makes a tremendous difference. So leaders that speak out about it, that it kind of destigmatize the seeking help, because they're promoting help seeking behavior, and they're reminding people, hey, you don't have to lose your career over it. It can make you stronger because of it. And that really sets an example for other people as well. And in fact, there have been people that we knew who got a buddy, say, to help, who saw somebody was struggling, noticed it, got them to leadership. And we encourage people, they should be, receive a commendation. They saved someone's life. And so acknowledging people asking for help and supporting people, it's kind of flipping the switch. And we're acknowledging, kind of saving lives. Like, they wouldn't leave them on a battlefield if they were struggling. So if we're saving people to our left and our right because they're struggling emotionally, we need to normalize that too. So, you know, it's a conversation. It takes time, but these are the things that from the lessons learned, you know, when leadership really makes this a priority, because, you know, putting up a poster and giving them a magnet, it's helpful to know the resource, but that's not enough. The climate from leadership and the culture, you know, people are watching, people are listening, and they know, hey, in my unit, they tell us if we need help, they'll support us going to the doc, or they'll support us, going to the chaplain. And that's really important. So just starting that conversation too, like, hey, what's the climate at work? How are they talking about, promoting mental well-being and kind of like this total fitness aspect? Like they don't care if you take 4 hours to go work out. So they should support you if you're going to take an hour to maybe go seek mental health support. So kind of normalizing it the way and making it a priority the way we do with all of the other aspects, are things to consider. Again, a really great question. And that changes from service to service, from, base to base, from leader to leader, but those are the things that really can kind of start shifting the conversation.
Thank you. Do you have many stories of like individuals in high leadership positions who like are actively going to counseling and talking about it candidly, whether or not it's like their child is sick or someone had a car accident or something like that, and there's like a visual translatable, oh, leadership in counseling, they didn't get fired.
Yeah.
Very one-for-one example of safety.
Yeah, and those are the things that, if you have personal experiences and you can share them, sometimes they might be things, on social media or, at TAPS, we have a lot of senior leaders who come to events and support us, and oftentimes they will share those personal experiences. There's a couple that I can think of who have done that openly. Let me see if I can maybe get some of the links to some of those, and I'll get them sent to back over to Amy and Sheila, and they can send those. There's a couple that I'm thinking of. I think it was a really high-ranking airman, really high-ranking, who shared very openly. There's some videos about it. And again, like from a leadership perspective, those things can be really helpful, because other people will say, I never heard about that. I've never heard anybody say, send the message that it's not going to ruin my career. So, it's got to start somewhere. And we know, like, many times spouses can move mountains. So, carrying on these conversations, it's definitely a starting point. But yes, there's what you touched on with that is addressing success stories, because we know the tragedy of a loss. Again, even one is too many. We hear about this far too often. At TAPS, unfortunately, we respond to this every day. But what we don't hear enough about are success stories about how suicide in some cases can be preventable. So in looking forward, in this conversation from a prevention perspective, focusing on the success stories, just as we would for, helping as survivors, helping to heal after a suicide loss, the same for people who might be struggling with thoughts of suicide. It's important to hear those success stories, because if all they're hearing about, are people who are dying and they never got help, it feels hopeless. So going back to that safe messaging piece, we want people to know that it can be preventable. In fact, there are success stories that people were able to get help. It did not ruin their career. They've talked about it publicly. And then it shifts the focus on how help can work, particularly within our military community, when they maybe haven't heard that message before. Oh yeah, I see. Yep. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There have been some really high-ranking open people who have shared about that. Really helpful to, sometimes you can catch those videos, or some of those speeches have been captured that you could share. And I'll see if I can maybe find someone, send them back along too. Well, great conversation. Thank you for all the comments, everybody. Yeah, I see what you said. Some of the leaders usually say it doesn't matter if it ruins your, yeah. And same thing will say like, well, as a spouse, I've heard it too, like, they don't meddle, don't get in the middle of my career. And we were afraid, like if I tell somebody, will it ruin their career? I mean, these are the things that from a spouse perspective, we would struggle with too. But whether it's a friend, whoever it is, I would much rather them hate me and never talk to me and have them be alive. And these are just the real hard conversations, like if and when, how do we, when somebody's sharing that with us and we're really concerned with them, having those difficult conversations, that's when that safe plan can be helpful just as a conversation tool. Like, okay, you don't want to go to talk to the doc. Who else would you think about talking? Let's come up with other ways because we want it to work for the person. And so maybe they don't want to go the military route and they say, no, I don't care what you say. I am not going to do that. Well, you know what? There are some good resources that people can get help that are kind of nonprofit outside of the military that don't have to go into people's record books. So those are more resources that can be helpful maybe for you all to be aware of. I can send some of those things as well. Again, people need to have options. So if they don't want to go through the military kind of rank and they're really worried about that, then we can look at getting help outside of that as well. Well,
I know
thanks.
one of the other things that I've heard recently is leaders of all levels and even just anyone, we all block time in our schedules when we're doing wellness. And so if that means for you going to a chaplain, going to meditate, going to see a counselor, putting that on there if you're comfortable so that people see that you're doing that mental health check-in for yourself and that self-care, it encourages other people to do the same thing. So
Yeah, you're kind of like
small
leading
thing
by
for all of us to
example.
do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any more questions? Okay, as I said, we'll send the resource guide out again. We have a few more things and then the links that Kristen was kind enough to find for us, I'll add those in as well.
Yeah.
So that concludes tonight's formal portion. We'll stick around for a few minutes to answer any questions or chat with anybody that has anything that they would like to speak about. We thank all of you for coming tonight, coming out for yourselves, coming out for each other, and coming out for our entire Space Force and Air Force communities. Thanks again to Carla for joining us. I know that all of the material you provided for us is definitely going to give us all some comfort coming forward and as we navigate these waters.
Yeah.
So thanks again.